Denis Davidov was a bold Russian warrior, poet, and rebel, a true adventurer who lived for battle and storytelling. He led daring guerrilla raids against Napoleon, changing Russia's military tactics forever. His poetry was wild and full of life, earning praise from great writers like Pushkin. Though his writings were censored, his legacy endured. This memoir, now fully translated into English for the first time, brings his thrilling first-hand stories to life, his battlefield victories, his fearless tactics, and his role in the Napoleonic Wars. A forgotten hero finally rediscovered. These are his words. Let's begin. Our army was retreating from Yankovo to Eylau. At that time, the rear guard was divided into two parts. One was under the command of General Barclay de Tolly, the other under General Prince Bagration. On January 23rd, Barclay de Tolly engaged the enemy near Depin, covering the army's retreat towards Wulfsdorf. On January 24th, it was Bagration's turn to cover the withdrawal from Wulfsdorf to Landsberg. The individual commanders of the rearguard were major generals, many of whom later became quite famous. Count Palin, Markov, Bagovut, Count Lambert, and others already with a reputation, such as Ermolov, who commanded the entire rearguard artillery, Prince Dolgoruki, Gogol, and Yurkovsky, who was in charge of the forward line. The engagement at Wulfsdorf was the first battle of my long military career. I will never forget the impatience and excitement I felt waiting for the first shots to be fired. Unsure of my own courage, I tried to mimic the confidence of the officers around Bagration, basking in their attention and absorbing their fearless, almost reckless attitude toward danger. Yet, it was Prince Bagration who had the greatest influence on me. Though I had not yet seen him in battle, I could already sense his inner strength and flashes of genius concealed beneath his outward calm. Later I would witness these qualities ignite into full flame on the battlefield, especially in moments when defeat seemed certain and all hope appeared lost. At dawn, the enemy launched a fierce assault on our forward line near Warlach, about 4 miles from Wulfsdorf. The rearguard took up arms at a position parallel to the highway leading from Gutstadt to Liebstadt. This position also protected a secondary road, which passed through Petersdorf, Dietrichsdorf, and Arensdorf, before leading to Open and Kaschauern. This was the path along which our rearguard was to follow the main army. The edge of the woods between Wulfsdorf and Elditen was swarming with Jagers from the 5th Regiment. Meanwhile, a small cavalry unit patrolled the left flank, keeping watch over enemy movements. The French vanguard, protected by a line of skirmishers, opened fire on our forward line using 1 or 2 cannons, while masses of troops emerged from the snow-covered hills, advancing toward Wulfsdorf. Yurkovsky, staying under cover of the Cossacks closest to the enemy, alternately halted and advanced, moving diagonally toward the right flank of the 5th Jager Regiment, beyond the wooded area. As adjutant to Prince Bagration, I had no command of my own. Eager to join the fight, I begged to be sent to the front under the pretense of monitoring enemy movements. In reality, my true motive was to prance about on my horse, fire my pistols, flourish my sword, and, if the chance arose, cut down an enemy in combat. I galloped over to the Cossacks, who were already engaged in a firefight with enemy skirmishers. One of the enemy soldiers closest to me, wearing a blue cape and a bearskin cap, appeared to be an officer. I suddenly had the wild idea of cutting him off from his line and taking him prisoner. I urged the Cossacks to help me with this reckless plan, but they only laughed at this eager young officer who had appeared out of nowhere with such a foolish proposal. No one was willing to follow my lead, and I still had just enough sense left not to take on a French officer alone, especially since reinforcements had just arrived to support him. Unfortunately, common sense quickly abandoned me. With reckless enthusiasm, I spurred my horse forward, coming within pistol range of the officer, and fired my shot. Without breaking pace, he immediately returned fire, and at the same time, his men also fired their carbines. These were the first bullets ever to whistle past my ears. Rather than frighten me, this filled me with pride and excitement. At that moment, everything outside of battle lost its meaning. Civilian life seemed worthless, and I felt as if I had been born for nothing else but war. Realizing the Cossacks were not coming to my aid, I decided to rely entirely on the speed of my horse. Anger surged within me, directed at a man I did not even know, a soldier who, like me, was simply fulfilling his duty. I drew closer, brandished my sword, and shouted insults in French, demanding that he face me in single combat. He cursed back at me, and we both stood motionless for a moment, neither of us making a move. By now, I had ridden far ahead of the Cossacks, coming within just a few steps of the French officer and his men. In truth, I had placed myself in a ridiculous and dangerous position, where I could have been easily captured or killed. At that moment, a Cossack sergeant galloped over to me, exclaiming, "Why all the swearing, Your Excellency? That's a sin. Fighting is a sacred duty. Swearing in battle is like swearing in church. God will punish you, you'll get killed, and so will we. Please go back to where you came from." His words snapped me out of my madness. Suddenly, my mockery of a Trojan hero seemed absurd. I turned my horse and rode back toward Prince Bagration. It is quite a challenge to command the rearguard of an army while it is being hotly pursued. The basic duty of such a commander is twofold. While maintaining the safety and discipline of the army as it retreats under enemy attack, he must at the same time keep the rearguard orderly and in close contact with the main body of troops. But, in the course of every battle, enforced halts may cause an increasing distance to open up between the rearguard and the army proper. If the rearguard concentrates on keeping in close touch with the other troops, therefore avoiding clashes with the enemy, it invites attack. Bagration resolved this dilemma, mastering the rules for rearguard tactics which, 14 years later, were exemplified on the island of St. Helena by the greatest exponent of the art of war, when he said, "The vanguard must keep pushing relentlessly, while the rearguard must maneuver." Bagration used this axiom as his guide for rearguard action in all his various later operations. Under Bagration's command, the rearguard never remained long in the same place and never trailed along in the wake of the army. In essence, it would keep retreating from one defensive position to another without offering total battle but maintained a threatening appearance by repeatedly repelling enemy thrusts, provoking a response with fierce and indiscriminate artillery fire. This is an operation that calls for a shrewd grasp of the situation, coolness, a sharp eye, and quick reactions, qualities with which Bagration was so well endowed. All this was quite beyond my comprehension. As a Hussar company commander, I hungered for a hot engagement. According to my strategy, it was absolutely necessary, and its likelihood was guaranteed by the fearless nature of the prince, who, in my opinion, was obliged to defend the Wolfsdorf position by all possible means, even at the cost of sacrificing the entire rearguard. I was so convinced that my reasoning was sound, so certain that everything would turn out differently if they only would listen to me, that neither Suvorov nor Napoleon would have been able to persuade me otherwise. This explains the stupid self-confidence that placed me in such a dangerous position and from which I was only saved by Providence. Upon my return from the front line to the prince, I was immediately dispatched by him to the 5th Jager Regiment, with orders to abandon the woods they had occupied and fall back on Dietrichsdorf, where a second position had been chosen for the rearguard. How can it be, I pondered, when so few troops have been committed to action, when no one in the regiment has even fired a shot, that we are to retreat? Is this the resolute, intrepid prince who has earned universal praise? Nevertheless, I galloped off to the Jaegers and carried out my order. In the meantime, our forward line continued to exchange fire with the enemy skirmishers and fell back towards the woods, which the Jaegers were supposed to vacate. It happened that on my way back to my post, and reflecting on how I might correct Prince Bagration's erroneous decision to give up the Wolfsdorf position without responding vigorously to the enemy attacks, I rode past the very front line where an hour earlier I had been exchanging swear words with my French officer. As luck would have it, I spotted the same Cossack sergeant who had interrupted my Homeric challenge with his prosaic good sense. As I trotted over to him, an even crazier idea suddenly struck me. I had read once, God knows where, that in some battles completely unknown soldiers had appeared and by sheer willpower had snatched victory from the foe despite strict orders to the contrary. My imagination ran rife. Perhaps I too was such a person, chosen by Providence to accomplish just such a feat. What I planned to do was to launch a frontal attack on the enemy, send it reeling, and break through with the 5th Jaeger Regiment, which was preparing to leave the woods. The prince, as witness to my success, would then reinforce me with the entire rearguard and inform Bennigsen, who would promptly come up with the whole army. In short, I aimed for nothing less than to defeat the entire enemy vanguard with a handful of horsemen and Jaegers and take the credit for vanquishing Napoleon himself. Passion spoke louder than reason, as was to happen too in other circumstances. I could see the whole scene in my mind. The entire area from Wolfsdorf to Warlach covered with dense columns of infantry, cavalry, and countless artillery pieces. I should have realized the foolishness of my undertaking, but obsessed with my audacious plan, I addressed the Cossack sergeant. "What do you say, brother? Shall we have a go at them?" "Why not, your excellency?" he replied, pointing at the skirmishers who were dashing about right under our noses, and added, "There are not many of them here. We could deal with them easily. Yesterday we were on our own, but today our infantry are close by and could give us a hand." "Right. You sell the idea to the Cossacks, and I'll have a word with the Hussars and Uhlans." We got our way. The troops all rose up, gave a shout, and hurled themselves at the enemy skirmishers. Swords clashed, bullets flew by, and the fight began. I remember my saber biting into live flesh and warm blood steaming from the blade. The fight did not last very long. The French skirmishers, who had been mauled by our men, beat a hasty retreat, but in our eagerness to chase them, we came up against their reserves, who galloped to their aid. These were dragoons with horsetails streaming from their helmets. They swooped on us hungrily, fresh blows were exchanged, and we in turn were beaten back towards the woods, where the Jaegers were no longer stationed and in a position to help us. The whole gigantic plan of my folly fell apart, and I, like Napoleon after Waterloo, gloomy and despondent, made my way back to the prince, skirting Wolfsdorf towards Dietrichsdorf, where the whole rearguard was headed. I rode alone through a valley, quite safe from the enemy because the dragoons who had thrashed us were content with their success and did not pursue us. But as I climbed a hillock, I suddenly found myself face to face with 6 French chasseurs à cheval, heading towards Wolfsdorf to observe our rearguard movements. Startled, I galloped away. They fired their carbines at me and seriously wounded my horse, which, for the moment, did not slow its pace. I thought I had shaken them off, but they were gaining on me from both sides. I looked around for any sign of help, but all I could see was our rearguard, marching toward Dietrichsdorf about 3 miles away. Beyond that, there was nothing, only the distant woods and the vast snow-covered battlefield. Disaster seemed imminent. I wore a pelisse, fastened at the throat with a single clasp, my sword drawn and my pistols empty, as I had no time to reload them. One of my pursuers, probably mounted on a faster horse, caught up to me, though not quite close enough to strike me with his sword. Instead, he grabbed the edge of my billowing cloak and nearly dragged me from my saddle. At that moment, Providence intervened. The clasp of my pelisse broke, and the cloak was torn away, slipping from my shoulders and leaving the Frenchman holding nothing but fabric. I kept galloping towards the woods, but my wounded horse was beginning to slow. The distance between me and my pursuers grew smaller and smaller. The winter had been short, and as a result, the swamps were treacherous, hidden beneath the thin snow. I had no time to search for a safe path. I simply raced forward, twisting and turning at random. Then, misfortune struck again. I entered the woods at the wrong point, where, unseen by me, the ground gave way to a swamp. My exhausted horse crashed into the freezing water, sinking up to its belly, unable to take another step. Moments later, a sharp blade flashed above my head. Death or capture stared me in the face. Then suddenly, from within the woods, a mighty yell rang out. A Cossack patrol of 20 men, dispatched by Yurkovsky to observe the enemy, burst from the trees and charged the Frenchmen, forcing them to retreat toward Wolfsdorf. One of the Cossacks, my true savior, rode up, lifted me onto his horse, and carried me to Yurkovsky, who quickly gave me the horse of a fallen hussar. That was how I rejoined our rearguard, now stationed near Dietrichsdorf. Meanwhile, Prince Bagration, ever the considerate commander, had grown worried about my fate. He asked every returning soldier whether I had been seen, but no one could give him an answer. Finally, I appeared before him, mounted on a strange horse, coatless, covered in mud, snow, and blood, yet feeling oddly triumphant, still relishing the thrill of my reckless charge and miraculous escape. Of course, I said nothing about my grand ambitions to defeat the entire French vanguard single-handedly. Instead, I gave the prince a simpler version of events. I told him only about my pursuers, my fall, and my rescue. Bagration, with a knowing smile, chided me lightly for my rashness, then had his men bring me his own warm coat to replace the pelisse I had lost. Shortly after, he recommended me for an award. That concludes the second part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content.